So we're going to talk today about Parsi identity and how that has changed over the years and what the impacts of that have been on Parsi women in particular. And I think we should probably start, because this is a somewhat niche topic and we are part of a very small group. We should probably begin with just some definitions of what a Parsi is and what a Zoroastrian is, what the connection is with Iran, and when the Parsis came to India.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you like me to just give a quick summary?
Yeah.
Okay. The Zoroastrian religion is very old, and we're not quite sure how old. It could be anywhere from 3,000 to 5 or even 6,000 years old. And it is the pre-Islamic state religion of Persia, which at that time was very large, extended all the way through Turkey, Anatolia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, of course, today's countries, all the way down to Egypt. At one point, the Persian Empire expanded, through conquest to quite a very large region. Now, the people who follow the religion of the prophet Zoroaster are called the Zoroastrians. But they may have any ethnicity, and that's a fine distinction, but becomes a fairly important distinction. So at around the time of the Arab conquest of Persia, you have hordes of horsemen essentially coming from the Saudi area into the rest of the Middle East and converting the local populations to Islam. Of course, they were met by the Persian army that was defeated in a number of battles. By that time, the Persian Empire had somewhat fragmented, and as a result, that entire area was Islamicized, essentially converted to Islam. Many villages at the point of a sword. There's historical documentation for this. So what happened to the Zoroastrians, right? A few stayed behind, a few thousand, and were progressively decimated through conversion, through kidnapping, through laws that disadvantaged them, impoverished them, and then essentially there were only a few pockets left in Yazd and Kerman who professed the religion of their ancestors, Zoroastrianism. But the rest of the community, progressively over time, from about 600 AD to 1000 to 1200 AD, came in dribs and drabs in small bands over the mountains, the Afghanistan range, the Hindu Kush, gaps or passes in the mountains in the Himalayas, and came down to Karachi, to Lahore, and then lower down into India. That's how North India got populated by a few groups of Zoroastrians. And then the rest did come in separate boats, in ships. The many that we know sank. They came to Gujarat and they settled there. And the local population said, well, where are you from? We're from Persia, which was then called Pars, P-A-R-S. And that's how you get the word Parsi. So who are the Parsis? They are the Zoroastrian refugees, medieval refugees, if you would, that came from Persia to India. They got that name Parsi, and then they intermingled. They married into the Hindu populations for the next, I want to say 600, 800,000 years, right up until the 1830s. And the reason we know that is our DNA is roughly 25% South Indian, South Asian. That means we did over centuries intermarry. Otherwise, there's no way you can get 25% of your DNA, to have that percentage of DNA being from that geography. So we know there was intermarriages. And the Parsis remained a very fairly exclusive or ethnocentric group, trying to preserve the traditions, the culture, the prayers of the past, even though they lived amongst the Hindus for 1,000 years, give or take. And that's who we call the Parsis. So you do have Zoroastrians who are still in Iran, and many have migrated to the US, to Canada, to Australia, to New Zealand, and elsewhere. And they're Zoroastrian. They're not Parsi. The ones that migrated to India are referred to as Parsi Zoroastrians. So I hope that helps.
Yeah. My friend Armin Navabi, who's also a Quillette contributor, was talking about a resurgence of Zoroastrianism within Iran. I don't want to talk about that in detail, but a lot of people who are declaring themselves Zoroastrian, it's a cultural thing. It's a kind of statement of opposition to the regime. So, Parsis have always been a very small minority within India, now an absolutely tiny minority, but have played an outsized role in Indian history. Do you want to talk also a little bit about that, why that is?
Absolutely. So this is a community that prides itself on adaptability, resilience, being able to adapt to adversity and make good, right? But the historical record shows that when the Parsis landed in India, they were desperately poor. They were struggling to learn Gujarati. They had, they were assimilating within the community, mostly farmers and very poor farmers at that. But over time, we're talking now from the 1200s to the 1800s, they became accountants, traders, very high level of education. So when you had the British occupying large swaths of India from the 1600s onwards, the Parsis had a reputation, still have a reputation for integrity and honesty. So they became trusted bankers and accountants and kind of right-hand men for many enterprises. They also were shipbuilders and such, really building empires of mills and not just factories, but sugar, cane, many different orchards. So we know this now because a lot of those ancestral properties, have been passed down from one generation to another. But in the 1800s, things, I would say 17 and 1800s, things did really take off for the Parsis because now you have an influx of these Parsi families. The men were being employed in banks. It was virtually unheard of to have anyone handling cash other than a Parsi. I mean, these are all maybe family myths a little bit, but anytime I meet anyone, they want to recount a favorite story of meeting a Parsi, of how their best friend is a Parsi, which is great. That means that we've built a really good reputation. But here's the thing, they became administrators, they became bankers, they started large ventures and were really India's first industrialists, the Tatas, the Godrejas, Palanji, Shapurji. We were talking about big organizations that are some of the largest private corporations in Asia today, were founded by Parsis. The first India's first steel mills and such. So you have Jamshedji Tata. The Brits recognized the need for some Indian representation in the British Parliament. So India was a colony, and the Grand Old Man of India, Dadabhai Naoroji, was a member of Parliament. There were three, actually. There was Sapurji Saklat. I think Saklat was a communist MP, very egalitarian. His daughter was extremely dynamic. And so you had these very influential people, Firsham Mehta, predominant lawyers. Oh, I have to tell you, the Parsis were, expanded into the legal professions in droves. So
Yeah.
that, and it makes sense because they wanted to know the laws, they wanted to apply the laws. They were educated, and they were the first to really espouse education for girls. I mean, we're talking about 1848. They had founded a society for education of girls, which within a few years had 1,200 Parsi girls attending, and they say in the annals, and a few Hindus. So we were not managing that on. We were including whoever wanted to come. It's kind of charming to know that, your first female graduates of universities were frequently Parsis. India's first female lawyer had a Parsi father, and so on. So we're really talking about a very educated community that became foundational to India's industrialization. And in that sense, really brought India, I'm talking about early 1900s, into the modern age. I was very much accepted by other communities, emulated, and very welcomed, while still being unique, preserving their own identity, preserving their culture. So that's sort of the
Yeah.
trajectory that we have there.
Yeah, probably a familiar story to people. The successful middleman minority, trading minority. The Chinese were that minority in many places in Southeast Asia. Gujaratis were often that minority. Also, of course, the Ashkenazi Jews is the most famous group.
Yes.
And I was wondering, actually, rereading your article before this interview, the Jews benefited in some ways from very rigid prohibitions that stopped medieval Christians from lending money out at interest, which is obviously something that you need to do if you want a flourishing economy. Then you have to lend money, and people are not going to lend for charity. Lending is risky. So that the prohibition against usury was a major block to economic growth and development. And so therefore, because the Jews didn't have that prohibition, they were able to become the financial powers. And I was actually wondering whether the Hindu caste system being such an extraordinarily rigid and stratified system, whether Parsis also benefited from being outside of that system.
Perhaps they did. The interesting aspect there is that there are a lot of taboos in the Hindu religion that had to do with travel. If you crossed large bodies of water, you lost caste, essentially, and you lost your privileges and became, shunned in a sense. And we have records of this from Ramanujan, who the famous mathematician who went to Oxford. When he came back home, nobody would touch him. He had to go through purification rituals in order to be accepted back into his mother's house, his father's house. So we know that was very predominant and controlling. Of course, you have fishermen that are allowed to go out because there's, caste of fishermen. They're going to go into the water. So water itself was not the taboo, but it was crossing large bodies of water. That was the taboo. And the Parsis had no such restrictions, so they got onto ships and they traded. They traded with China. There's a vast number of, in fact, many of our cultural heirlooms are unique objects brought back by those traders from China. In fact, when it was entirely legal to trade opium, Parsis made vast fortunes in the opium trade. I'm thinking, construction, this last name contractor. Many Parsis had this last name contractor, and many of our names are functional names. They're names of places or occupations, which was required by the British administrators in the 1800s. You had to come up with a last name. But that word contractor really meant somebody who could work with wood. So it didn't necessarily mean that you were taking contracts, but it meant that you were a building contractor, essentially. And the numbers of them, it just shows that they, were employing vast numbers of people. But that's really the taboos against certain things, perhaps in the Hindu culture, allowed Parsis who didn't have those taboos to flourish. Women, for example, in the Hindu culture, in noble families, women were in barda. That is pretty much seclusion. And that means that they did not leave the home. They were not visibly seen. Their faces would not be uncovered for anyone other than blood relatives, someone in your own family. Parsis had no such restrictions and quickly adapted to Western ways of eating instead of the Hindu tradition of eating on the floor and eating in by genders, males first, then women, then children, then women, which is a traditional Hindu sequence. Parsis did not have those. They just didn't have the tradition of it. So eating together was common, and eating at a table and sitting on chairs and using implements. Parsis really were Anglophiles. They tried to copy everything that was British or Western. They loved. Right up until my childhood, we had more Western classical music in the house than Indian classical music. Same with movies, with languages, with books. And so really having the Anglophile mentality meant that you got a lot of association with the British community, and the colonial rulers reciprocated in many ways, because they did need representatives of the native population. And so the Parsis were happy to take on that role. I don't I'm not saying that we were the exclusive right-hand men or something like that. We were among, there were other communities for sure. And we had a lot of Jewish friends. There was a lot of commingling with the communities that had that culture. That had the music and the literature and the painting and the art culture. So those were certainly benefits to the Parsi population. So I'll give you another example. When Rabindranath Tagore, India's magnificent poet laureate, tried to enter a restaurant, essentially a club in those days, his wife was repelled. She was rejected because she had the traditional Bengali sari where just a drape of cloths was covering her breasts. And it is entirely traditional in a hot country to have that, just be covered by a drape of cloth. Well, the Brits thought that was obscene and rejected her, elderly woman. But Parsis had no such problem because they wore shirtwaists, little blouses, little shirts underneath the sari. And then they would use that as a frilly little blouse and then have the drape of the sari right over it. So you have pictures where they mashed the Western and Indian clothing so elegantly that they kind of created a fashion sense of their own. And I laughed because, here you have women, Hindu women, very brilliant, many of them, very few were educated, but they were so suppressed because of a cultural taboo and the prudishness of Victorian morality, whereas the Parsis somehow adapted and didn't have that restriction.
It's interesting that the traditional Parsi garu, the saris, have chinoiserie embroidery on them. So that's also bears witness to the importance of trade and exchange.
Indeed, many of our heirlooms are basically a dark color background silk, a beautiful silk upon which you have a white motif, sometimes colored, but mostly white. So white on plum purple, white on red, white embroidery on a deep maroon or a deep blue. And these are heirlooms that are probably, over 100 years old and cherished saris. The other type of sari, again, that style of embroidery is uniquely Chinese. The border of the sari might be just one color, but the border is embroidered and actually affixed onto the sari. They're called garas and kors. These are traditional, jewels. They're literally precious to families. These are heirlooms. Other things I can remember in my grandma's house were Chinese vases. There were these large, gorgeous vases that might have been brought over on a ship 200, 300 years ago. Again, testament to the trade that occurred. Yeah, and you have to remember, this is a time when ships were, running on sails and they went down constantly, and a very dangerous occupation. Obviously needed a lot of skill to navigate. But the Parsis were building ships. They were building not only, sail ships, but steamships for the Brits. In fact, the ship that carried Francis Scott Key when he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner that was a Wadia-built ship.
Ah.
we kind of like to find these little stories and, feel connected to history.
Well, it's all over Bombay. I mean, when I lived in Bombay, so many cultural monuments, so many hospitals, schools, bridges, striking architectural features, libraries, schools, colleges. So many of those were Parsi founded or Parsi built, as you can
That's
tell
right.
immediately from the weird
Yes.
Parsi names, which sound so odd to someone unused to them. The very long.
They have their statues everywhere. It's sort of when a Hindu wants to do charity, he donates to his temple. So you have very, very wealthy temples with gold and enormous stores, and they might have, I don't know, more than the Smithsonian even, in terms of antiquities and just precious jewels and things like that. But Parsis did not have that compulsion or requirement to donate to temples. We do have temples. We have, stone temples here and there. But the way that we were always trained to give back was through philanthropy. And that meant helping people of all communities. That's why you have all those educational institutions and hospitals and, so one way that they would give back would be to give free water. At that time, we think about a time before plumbing, to water was a scarce commodity. So frequently you would have fountains built by a Parsi philanthropist where one part would be for humans to drink from, another part would be troughs for animals to drink from. So giving water was a big deal. Every intersection would have something, donated somewhere by the Parsis. And therefore the names, the street names have Parsi names. You have statues of these long lost, long dead people that again are Parsi and are recognized as such. They're very characteristic clothing, characteristic hats, kind of like a bowler, but very flat rim, just a little thickness to the rim, that kind of bowler hat, or then a shiny pointed hat with a little bit of a angle to the back of it. Again, these are very characteristic hats that are not used by the general population. Like the turbans, usually in India, you can distinguish historical photographs by the size of the turbans or the style of the turban. And those two hats that I just described are indicative of Parsis. So they're memorialized all over in pictures that are drawn, showing the Mughal Empire. We're talking, 1700s. There are Parsis in his ministry, and we know that because of those distinctive hats.
So I want to talk a little bit about how Parsi identity is defined and how it's been defined over the centuries, and what is happening now or has been happening more recently with discrimination against Parsi women. So as some people will know, my father was Pakistani Parsi. I spent my earliest years in Pakistan. I lived in the Parsi Bagh. The Bagh is like a bit like a gated community. Actually, probably more similar in look and feel to an Oxford or Cambridge college, or like the quad at Sydney Uni for anybody local who's listening. That looks like a Parsi Bagh as well. It's a courtyard or a few courtyards of low-rise buildings, which are usually flats, and in the middle there's a cricket pitch. There's usually a fire temple. There's often a pavilion with old people playing chess and bridge outside. There might be a canteen and perhaps a little supermarket or convenience store. And I grew up in one of those Parsi Baghs in Karachi, or at least in my earliest years, and I did have a Naujot, which we'll also talk about maybe in a moment, which is the initiation ceremony into the Zoroastrian religion. So I think I was 7. But my mother was British. My parents died when I was fairly young. I moved to the UK. I grew up with non-Parsi people, and I had absolutely no connection with Parsi life at all. And I also forgot the Parsi Gujarati that apparently I did speak at one stage, but I completely lost it. And I basically grew up most of my life as a totally westernized person, and I also don't look very Indian. And in my mid-40s, I decided to rediscover my Parsi roots, and I went to Bombay for a couple of years. And in Bombay, I lived in a Parsi Bagh in Bombay, the Kushru Bagh. And I was told by a lot of people before I left that people wouldn't accept me in India because my mother was not Parsi, and that I wouldn't be allowed to go to the Parsi fire temples or take part in Parsi life in India. And I didn't find that to be the case, but I think I was kind of lucky. And there were some occasions on which people were a little bit worried. And a few times the woman I lived with said, oh, some very more conservative people were going to be coming over, and I should tell them that my mother was Iranian, because that would explain my pale skin. I should tell them that my mother was an Iranian Parsi called Shireen. So that was a kind of cover story that I occasionally trotted out, but mostly wasn't necessary. Surprisingly, mostly people accepted me. And when I was back in the States, I'd been warned that I was in the States immediately before I went. And I had been warned by the Parsis there that this wouldn't be the case because they'd had bad experiences in the past. This idea that has taken hold more recently, that Parsi identity is basically patrilineal, that hasn't always been the case. So would you like to talk about that? Go back a little bit in history. How did this begin? And when did the identity shift from being more open to being matrilineal to being patrilineal?
Yeah, so the article traces this sequence. We think that, again, based on our DNA, that up until 1830, that there was a lot of intermarriage going on, and either having a Parsi mother or father kind of entitled you to, call yourself a Parsi, have your Navjot, and just be accepted. But something changed in the 1830s. So there's a period of time when the Protestant ministers were very active in the community, meaning there were discussions in newspapers, there were meetings where the religions were discussed. They were actively trying to convert, especially the youth, to Christianity. The Anglican, community there was very active in trying to proselytize. So you do have, a series of very dramatic conversions. It happened in sequences. So between 1839 to 1900, there's a very interesting paper by Farshid Namdaran, which talks about 15 young men, Parsi men, who converted to Christianity. Well, the community was extremely concerned by this because it was seen as a betrayal. It was seen as, an abandonment of the religion, the culture, the traditions, and even their own families. And many of those, at least 5 of the 15, were not able to make a living. They would not be given jobs. They were shunned. They were excommunicated, so to speak. And many of them, those 5 for sure, but maybe others, then eventually fell back on the church for a living. And some went to England, some went to different parts of rural India. So one of them, for example, if you've seen George and Arthur, the TV series, it talks about the real life situation of George Idalji. Well, his father was one of those 15 who had been sent to a tiny little village in England as a pastor, just to give him a living. He had 3 children. One of them was blamed for some crime like mutilation of cattle, whatever. And the young man, George Idalji, then appealed to Arthur Conan Doyle. And essentially, even though he had gone through 3 years in jail, this young man begged the famous author to prove his innocence, which he did. And from that incident, we now have internationally in every country a court of appeals, which did not exist
Right.
in that
Right.
case. Indeed, which is why I spent so much time on it. But you do, I think, have other young men. So Cornelia Sorabji is India's first female lawyer who went to Oxford and studied law in 1888. She came back and was not allowed to take the bar because she was a female. So she came back with
Parsi woman, of course.
yeah. Came back with a full legal education, but not allowed to stand before a judge and plead a case. So she just became somebody that would write briefs, prepare the cases, and have the men perform the actual duties and make the big bucks. But she also spent 30 years of her life fighting for the rights of the women who were in Barda. And because they were in seclusion, if their husband died, frequently the man of business or the other male relatives would take the money, would take the property, and she would fight for their rights. So she is an interesting woman because her father was one of those 15. He converted to Christianity. He married a adopted child of an Irish officer, and then they had 4 children, but they were not allowed, not included in the community in India, in Mumbai, in Bombay. So they went out into Pune, Nasik, and elsewhere, Surat maybe, and had school there. And one of their daughters is married to, a famous doctor. She became a doctor herself. The other daughter, of course, Cornelia, becomes the India's first female lawyer. Another son, so Cornelia's brother, became a famous lawyer. So they did wonderful things, but they were brought up outside the community because of the mistake or what was called, the sin of leaving the community at that time. It changed how we viewed identity, this fear of losing the youngsters, losing the youth. And as a result, the Parsi elders slammed down on any intermarriages. So if girls married out or boys married out, they were lost to the community. It's kind of a way of closing ranks and protecting the identity. See, at that point in time, you did have child marriage. So 1800s, most women are married by the age of 10. And Parsis, too, had child marriage. We also had Behramji Malabari, so reformers saying that child marriages shouldn't happen and so on, but they did. So what would happen is a couple is married at the age of 3 by their parents. They essentially marry them off like a pair of dolls. And when they grow up, they aren't necessarily compatible. So what? They end up having separate lives and cohabiting with other people. Now, it was customary that if the mother was Parsi, that the children would be accepted because, clearly she's given birth. She knows who she's given birth to. But there were a few landmark cases and navjots which tilted the discrimination, tilted the situation in favor of the men and towards discrimination of women. And those are, on one side, I feel like it was good that those things happened because they at least allowed some of the intermarried children to be accepted. But on the other hand, they codified the discrimination against women. So what are those things that happened, events? So a couple of them are landmark cases, lawsuits, and a couple of them are group navjots. So this is a good time to say, what is a navjot? Typically at the age of, 5, 7, 9, 5 is kind of early, but 7 or 9, the child is initiated into the religion. They learn their prayers, by heart. And then there's a big party where the child is, brought before the community. The priest will put on a ceremonial sudre, which is a white muslin cloth, on their body, say the prayer, and help them tie their kushti, which is a thread, like a little twine of lamb's wool around their waists, and teach them or say with them the daily prayers, kind of for the first time. And after that, they're supposed to do it themselves every day. And since my Navjot, when I was 7, I have done it pretty much every day. But that then becomes, in front of everyone, you're claiming, I am a Zoroastrian. Your parents are claiming, this is my child, she's a Zoroastrian. And the whole community comes and hugs you and gives you presents. So what's not to love? It's a very special ceremony and a fun time for children and a welcoming of them into the religion. Now, without that ceremony, technically that person is not a Zoroastrian, even though you may be born a Parsi. There were 2 group Navjots of people, men and women, whose fathers were Parsi and whose mothers were non, typically Hindu women. So legally, there's a certain distinction that we have to make here. So the Parsi Marriage and Divorce Act of 1865, why does this matter, right? You have, at this point in time in the 1800s, there are laws being written by the British judges and legislators for India. India has no say in this. But they're trying to be very benevolent, so they made separate laws for the Muslims, Hindus, Christians, and Parsis. Separate laws based upon their cultural traditions. Well, at that point in time, to be married under the Parsi Marriage and Divorce Act of 1865, both of them had to be Parsi. If they did not, there's this 1872 Special Marriage Act where you have intermarried couples, they both have to renounce their religions. And of course, Parsi men did not want to renounce their religion, so if they cohabited, essentially they're, keeping mistresses, and what about those children? So you have this 1882 group Navjot of dock workers. These are people working in Mazagon docks who went to the famous Dastur Jamshed Kukadaru, who today is venerated as a saint. And they asked this man, can you please do our Navjot? Now, they were advanced. One of them was 70 years old. From 35 to 77, that's the range of their ages. There were also 2 infants, 2 years old and 4 years old, which typically you would never do a Navjot for the children. They're just they're infants. They're too young to know what they're doing. But he understood that this community, this group of dock workers should be protected, should be given the protection of the name of being Parsi. And there was no question that their fathers were Parsi, meaning the fathers acknowledged having these children. Probably even came and asked him, said, I don't know what to do. Can you please accept my child? And so he did it. He and 4 other priests, a group of priests, not just him alone. He was not that much of a renegade. But they did this combined Navjot, and they included these, people who were progeny of intermarried couples. But again, it's the fathers were male. The fathers were Parsi males. You have another situation where 77 people were instituted into the Zoroastrian religion, through an group initiation in Vasda, Gujarat. Here again, you have to understand the geopolitics, for lack of a better word. You have large swaths of land that are owned by Parsi owners. Their families may be in Bombay the cities, but they're living in these rural areas and they end up having Hindu mistresses. So a lot of the children from those mixed couplings were called Setnas, meaning belonging to the Set. Setna, of the Set. Set meaning the boss's child. And that's that is now a last name. It's his common last name. So what do you do when they say, this group says, well, we have a Parsi father, we want to be Parsi? So there were prominent families, Wadias and Banaji families, that were wealthy families. They supported this and they said, okay, these people should be accepted. And so they got a group of Dasturs, priests, to go out and do 77 Navjots in one shot. And the Parsis in Bombay were all up in arms. They were all protesting. 20,000 of them signed a protest letter and nothing came of it, Meanwhile, who are they protesting to? Who's adjudicating all this? There is that trust body, the Bombay Parsi Panchayat, which is a landowner. It has over 5,500 flats and residences that it rents out. It is a repository of a lot of ancestral Parsi wealth. It's the trust. And they also had certain responsibilities to protect the community, but they choose who they're going to protect. So essentially, these two events, the two group Navjots, really made it okay to be a Parsi, to be called a Parsi if your father is Farsi. And I think you benefited from that as well, Iona.
Yeah.
What about the girls? What about the women?
Yeah.
Well, there's two events that then disadvantage them, right? Two landmark cases. The first is the Bella case. This is a child who was adopted by a Parsi man in Rangoon, Burma. A lot of Parsis had moved there and became fairly wealthy. And he adopted this child because her Parsi mother begged him on her deathbed, please take care of my child. And when he said, who's the father? She said, he's dead. He was a sailor and probably an Englishman. So this is the Anglo-Indian child, right? We think. But this gentleman adopted the child, and Sapurji Kalasji is the name of the elderly Parsi man. He was already in his late 60s when he adopted her. Well, when she turned 14, he was worried for her and wanted her to be generally accepted as a Parsi so that you could marry a Parsi man, right? And his brother protested again, I think, just because they wanted to keep the money, for themselves. Sapurji Kalasji had no biological children. So now there was a lawsuit that went from, about 10 years and ended in 1925. And this is the landmark ruling which said, as regards to the racial claim, maternity had no importance. These are the words of a British judge. There were two judges, a Parsi judge and a British judge, but they essentially made the community patrilineal legally. And so Bella was rejected officially as a Parsi. Now, the ironic part is it took 10 years for this ruling. During those 10 years, she got married under the Parsi Marriage Act to a Parsi man. So she was okay. She was taken care of. She was safe. She had her Navjot, so everyone accepted her as Parsi, except for her uncle who wanted to keep the money for himself. But she didn't need it. She had a good life and she was accepted and is supposed to have been, historically, they say she was a very happy person. The other case that came to mind, again, these rulings may have had happy endings, but they became a precedent against Parsi women. You have the 1908 Petit versus Jijibai lawsuit. Now, this is a tragic one because the problem was that a very wealthy businessman, Ratan Tata, the father of J.R.D. Tata is, a name to be reckoned with in India, created the entire aviation industry, headed up the Tata Group. Well, his father was already in his 40s, went to England. He was not well. He fell in love with his nurse, and he was already a widower, so he married her. And she was a French woman and decided to take the name Sunu because she had golden hair. So Sunu means like goldie hair. And he had a big wedding with her. He had her Navjot done before the wedding. And a lot of Parsis accepted that, she's converted and she's married him and we're all happy for them. Well, no, because it was an Orthodox group led by Jamshedji Jijibai. This is, again, a venerated name, but he was an Orthodox person. And he said, nope, since she is not born a Parsi, she should be excluded from the temple. There were judges, again, Justice Davar and Justice Beeman, again, a Parsi and an Englishman, that agreed that because she was not born a Parsi, that she should be excluded. Again, British law did not support women. It was intrinsically patriarchal and exported that patriarchy into the Zoroastrian community in India, the Parsis. Now, she had a happy life and they had this wonderful J.R.D. Tata, magnificent philanthropist, industrialist, aviator, and chairman, and just an incredible individual, and other illustrious children as well. They had a good life, but the tragedy is really that ruling is then cited against women, Parsi women, because we do not have that equality in law that is afforded to others. And to be clear, this discrimination against women is very predominant today. About half of men and women marry outside the community, about half. So if a man marries outside the community, his children are still, welcomed in, allowed to have navjots. If the woman marries outside, and they do, they are essentially lost to the community. That means every year we are losing 1/4 of the next generation. And no wonder we have a 20% decline. Every decade our numbers go down about 10%, so 20% every decade. There are other incidents, but these. So what does it mean when the women marry out and they aren't accepted? It means that they do not qualify to live in those rent-controlled bogs. The families that do live in the bogs essentially have minimal, we're talking about, cents on the dollar, like cents. They're paying minimal rent. They are able to accumulate vast fortunes because essentially free housing in a, very, very...
and it's lovely. Yeah. Especially Khushru Bagh. I think I lived in the nicest one. But they are beautiful little oases of verdant calm amid Bombay, Yeah.
Yeah, and so they're close to their work. They have opportunities. So housing is one place where they're discriminated against, but there are many other places as well. In fact, I would say, the Parsi Marriage and Divorce Act, that law, is India's most regressive law that still exists on the books. And why do I make that claim, which is kind of a extreme claim? All other laws, that is the Muslim law, Hindu law, Christian law, Buddhist, whatever else, they all accept rulings in courts that are outside the country. But the Parsi law, Parsi court does not, which forces women to relitigate any divorces outside the country. They have to come back to India and relitigate that, because otherwise they will not be that divorce is not accepted, which is a huge burden on Parsi women if they're at the country and they have to come back to India to relitigate. We're talking about 5-7 years. They also are the only court which still has a jury system. The rest of India, juries were stopped. There were no jury system trials. They were all judged by judges. But in India, the Bombay Parsi Matrimonial Court is still adjudicated by a jury. Well, where does the jury come from? They come from 20 members, which are selected by, drumroll please, the same trust that handles all the properties, the Bombay Panchayat. And that panchayat, they have become the kind of bastion of orthodoxy in many ways. Two extremes. So I'll give you one extreme. That is, if you look it up, the tragedy of, the baby Farzin starvation death. So in 2009, a 7-year-old was found starved to death. And this child was born of a Parsi father who had abandoned the non-Parsi mother. And the non-Parsi mother had gone, the Hindu lady, had gone to the panchayat, had begged them for some form of support. She was working as a household worker, a domestic worker, and had 3 children to support. And the Parsi panchayat said, no, we won't. We won't take care of you. We won't support you. You have to show proof of marriage, proof that you're married to a Parsi. And she didn't have the papers. Obviously, the husband had taken them. The children were starving to the extent that the 7-year-old who was taking care of the younger children actually died. In the autopsy, it was found she had not eaten in 2 days. So the community was shamed by this utter callous cruelty. Anyway, no, that's really that story that shows how extreme the orthodoxy can be, and can result in such complete travesty of justice. Yeah, since then, I want to say things have gotten better, but really the lines of demarcation have been very clearly drawn, and they have been drawn against women.
Mm-hmm. It's a slight digression, but I think it's a very interesting story why it is that India does not have trial by jury apart from in the Parsi matrimonial court. And before we go into that story, just as a small digression also, because the community is so tiny, the Bombay community, I think, is only about 25,000. The jurors in the court are often know the bride and groom very well and are friends of the family. It's a really small, close-knit community. Yeah, so that actually also changes the way that it feels to be in a trial by jury system. It's not anonymous.
It is not anonymous. It is no way fair. And you're right. Everyone knows everyone. It is also very easy for the spouse that is in the bog, for example, I have a situation about the other Parsi colony where the family that lives there is touted by everybody to be, so generous, so wealthy, so philanthropic. Whereas I know personally that family, that spouse has not paid towards his minor child in 2 years. He's a deadbeat dad. And he's a piece of, garbage, in my opinion. But he's touted by everybody else because he's known to the community as, such a good guy. And his wife, who is desperately trying to survive, is badmouthed again because she's not present in the bog and she's away from Dada or from India. So it's very cliquish. It can get extremely clannish, extremely cliquish, and therefore, justice goes out the door.
So tell us how it is that India came to abandon the trial by jury system.
That is
in
kind
most
of
courts.
Story. Yeah, there's a fictional version of it in the Hindi movie Rustam. And if you watch that movie, it's really rather well done. Of course, it is fictional, but the facts of the case, are fairly similar. So in 1959, India was really rocked by what was called the trial of the century. Essentially, there was a Navy commander, and K.M. Nanavati, so I think his name is Kavas Nanavati, and that gentleman found out that his wife was having an affair.
A Parsi man, of course.
Parsi man, yes.
Yeah.
Found out his wife was having an affair, and this person was Prem Ahuja is the name of his wife's lover. He went to the armory, checked out a weapon, went and shot the man, and then turned himself in and confessed to the crime. And all of this is public record. But then when it went into trial, things went completely awry. It was extremely chaotic because there were a few newspapers that took his side. And again, Parsis were very much into the news, journalism industry and influence public opinion to the extent that the jury delivered a not guilty verdict, even though he never rescinded his confession. And they basically said he was not guilty on the grounds of grave and sudden provocation. But this was a travesty of justice because clearly murder had been committed. Now, realizing that the public could be so deeply influenced, then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru abandoned the idea of having jury trials because you don't have a population that was civic-minded, educated, just emotional and easy to sway, especially by newspapers who really knew how to tell the story. So that was the end of all jury trials in India, and judges were then appointed to rule on cases, but I believe about 20 to 30% of judging positions are vacant. And judges are frequently bribed, they're frequently extorted or threatened, and cases therefore go on and on and on in India. So why did this one situation of the Parsi Marriage and Divorce Act, right, that particular court continues, the matrimonial court continues because the Parsi Marriage and Divorce Act has a requirement that 5 community members must adjudicate divorces, and that includes maintenance and custody and rights. And I can guarantee you that those divorce rulings are predominantly overseen by male jurors. There are very few women jurors on that committee. So again, women are disadvantaged in multiple ways. But yeah, that was kind of a interesting story about Nanavati. Captain Nanavati then migrated. He left India. He went to Canada. He has since passed away. But the family still continued. He stayed with his wife. His wife stayed with him, did not divorce him. And in some sense, he became a little bit of a folk hero even for protecting his wife's honor. And the movie really romanticizes it. The movie itself. It is a charming movie, and it shows layers and layers that may or may not have existed. But it is true in many ways that Nanavati was, not just the facts of the murder, but the facts of the bribery and corruption that was endemic in the purchases that the Navy and military were making. And that's how the movie ties it up, ties the two things together, corruption in military purchases and him essentially lashing out at somebody who is both corrupt as well as having corrupted his wife. Again, the facts of the matter are clean, are simple, but then there's a romanticized version.
Yeah. So I think that we talked about some of the disadvantages to the women who marry out and their children. One being they don't have access to some of the services like the bags, and I think there's also an old age pensioners home and a few other hospitals and other things which are for Parsis only subsidized by the community. And then also there is a disadvantage in the marriage courts and with inheritance, etc. And the other element of that, which we haven't touched on so much, is that the women who've married out and their offspring are not allowed into the places of worship. So the Agiaries, the fire temples, the Zoroastrian fire temples in India, which have, usually there's a guard at the door and there's a sign saying Parsis only. And actually, before I went to India, I was very nervous about this, but I waltzed into pretty much every Agiary in Bombay. I made a point of visiting them all, and I also went to the now suddenly the name has gone out of my head, but there's a big one in Gujarat,
Udvada.
Udvada. I also went to Udvada, and I was only asked once. Once someone came up to me and he said, "Ma'am, are you a Parsi?" And I just said yes, and that was the end of that. But yeah, it is restricted to Parsis only, and obviously it's one thing to just be casually going into a temple, which you can probably get away with if you're dressed the right way and you look Parsi or can kind of pull it off. But it's quite another thing when it's a specific ceremony related to your family where everyone knows exactly who you are. And one of the court cases that you talk about in the article was 2 women who had married Hindu men, and they were not allowed to go to the fire temple for the funerary rites of their own parents, which is absolutely extraordinary. And I've actually been to Parsi funerary rites in Bombay, and that's not even anybody I was actually related to. I've gone to two funerals. I've been invited. So that's an absolutely extraordinary. And eventually they did win that case, I know. So now that they were, I don't know if the parents are still alive or not, but they were able to go to, or will be able to go to, their parents' own funerary rites when their parents die, but they themselves can't have Zoroastrian funerary rites, and they can't otherwise go to the Agiaries. They're otherwise debarred from that. So that's another troubling aspect.
Absolutely. So the two ladies, their parents were still alive, but the temple had told them that they would not be allowed, as and when the time comes, they would have to stay outside and would not be allowed to attend their parents' funeral ceremonies. I don't know whether the parents are still alive, but they won that case. It just took them almost 10 years to do that. 2017, they won that case. But you're right. Since the temples, the Agiaries, are owned by trusts, they're being administered a little bit like petty fiefdoms. And the trust decides who they're going to, the trustees decide who they're going to allow in or not. And so some are a little bit more inclusive, and many are still, really forbidding, as you said, and try to prevent anyone else. The tragedy is that most of these Agiaries are empty for 99% of the time, because they were built during a time when there were 114,000 Parsis in India, and now we estimate less than 40,000. So even though they are mostly empty, the orthodoxy, or the very old-fashioned group, still operates out of fear that others will come in and somehow dilute the faith, dilute the traditions, dilute the gene pool, who knows what. But that's a mentality, a kind of fear-based thinking that definitely runs, disadvantages women, particularly. So you may say, so they can't attend the temple, so what, right? But a lot of the Parsi traditions involve going to the temple on birthdays, on festival days. Making the offerings is part of practicing your own religion. And India does give freedom of religion. It does say that no one shall prevent you from practicing your own religion. So having these petty fiefdoms and tyrants, little mini tyrants running a community property, is problematic because it goes against the Constitution of India. And at some point, I'm sure that will come up before the Supreme Court and will be adjudicated, because there are a number of women who are fighting cases. In 2021, there was a Parsi woman married to a Hindu man who filed a discrimination lawsuit on behalf of herself and her 7-year-old son. And that case has not come up before the Supreme Court yet. But there are at least a half a dozen other cases. And to top it off, the Indian government recognizes that these individual laws that you have are arbitrary. The Muslim law and the Hindu law, and they're not consistent. So there is an attempt next year, 2026, to institute a uniform civil code. Every country has a uniform civil code by India. So why have all these religious distinctions? And of course, because men still run the Parsi Panchayat and men still want to maintain their patriarchy. Therefore, they're protesting that which will make women more equal, give them equal rights, or at least more equal, and that will force them, the males, to lose their advantage, their privilege. So this is going to come to a head, in the next couple of years. Certainly, it just is a tragedy to me, Iona. And, as a writer, I love the community. I admire the community tremendously. It's a tragedy to me that a community that is so progressive in so many other ways is so ridiculously regressive when it comes to gender
Yeah.
equality. When it comes to gender
Yeah.
equality, it is not progressive at all.
And it's absolutely counterproductive to the survival of the Parsi and Zoroastrian culture. Nev, is there anything else that you would like to have said that I haven't given you a chance to say?
Well, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my books. I have a series, the historical mystery series, that started with Murder in Old Bombay, and that talks about two Parsi women who, it's a real case, a real tragedy. In 1891, went to the top of the university clock tower, and for whatever reason, first one, then the other, fell to their death. So my story starts there. I have two more books, where I have an immigrant sleuth couple that goes through different adventures, all historically based. They're all real events that I kind of drawn a thread through. And then the fourth book that just came out earlier in May talks about the couple going back to India, and they face many of these situations. In fact, the guy we talked about, Dastur Kukadaru, features in book number 4. So,
Oh, I can't wait to read that. I just finished book 3, and I highly recommend. And I'll link to your books and also to an earlier discussion podcast we did, which was about your first book. Yeah, I'm the first book is still my favorite because of the setting. So I am looking forward to them returning to India.
thank
um,
Thank you. Yeah, it's was such a joy and so much fun to write. And it is turned into such a lovely adventure. And it's tied to real things, real events that occurred. There really was a dog riot where the Parsis were the first community to riot against the British. Even though they were total loyalists, they rebelled because of a British rule that required the culling or killing of stray dogs. The dogs would bark and make a nuisance of themselves in the afternoon, and then the Brits were hiring dog catchers essentially to kill them and were paying for the carcasses. And, dogs are very integral to the community. So many of Parsis have pets, but also in the religious theology, every creature is supposed to have good and evil, but dogs have only good. They are God's
mm.
perfect creation. So they're
I
supposed,
believe that.
yeah, isn't it? They're supposed to be cared for, and they're man's best friend essentially. So to have them killed in such a cruel way was just anathema to the Parsis, and they actually had a riot. I just could not get over that, and that is of course then embedded in my book. But there's so many actual little traditions and little events and situations that are from reality, from the real world, that I was able to weave into the narrative. So I just had so much fun with this. I think of it as a little time capsule where I'm weaving these little motifs into my story, and they're not just fluff; they are integral to the plot. So I
Mm.
just think that is a neat thing to do, and hope to keep doing that.
Yeah, I'm really looking. I hope you continue. I hope there are many more books in the series because I absolutely love it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Iona. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you.
Been my pleasure.